So today we're talking with Hildegard Pleva at her lovely home here in the town of Esopus. This is our series on folks who have some great history in Italian, of course. So Hildegard, that doesn't sound Italian to me, so explain that first of all.
My father was born in Germany
Uh-huh.
and came to the United States in 1928 during the severe inflation situation in Germany at that time. And he and a younger sister and his parents came and lived in the Bronx. And then at a party to which my mother was brought by her Sicilian-born father to say goodbye to a guy who had just been drafted into the army during World War II, my father and my mother met at this party. And the story was that he saw my mother and said to his buddy, "There's the girl I'm going to marry." When they got married in August of 1943, he was 21 and she was 18. Completely different backgrounds, totally. And they were married 69 years.
So I find this interesting because I know of a lot of Irish-Italian combinations. I've never heard too much about German and Italian, and it worked out 69 years, so it must have been a wonderful union.
And they loved each other as much and as romantically after all that time as they did when they first met. And I have all their letters exchanged during World War II.
Yeah.
Oh.
So did you grow up more Italian or more German?
Well, it was an Italian household because my mother was 8 and had a 3-month-old brother when her mother died. So my mother was in charge. It was her father's house. They had a very hard time in the Depression, but my grandfather amazingly was able to hold on to the house. There were rental apartments that had been made upstairs. And when my parents married, neither of them had a pot, as they used to say.
Right.
So when he came out of the service, I was already 6 months old, and we all lived together. So we were 6 people in 6 rooms until about I was 14 or 15 years old, because my mother's younger brother was also part. So it was a 3-generation family, and it was very much an Italian-American household.
Yeah. Usually the Italian side dominates. I noticed that in growing up.
Right.
My mother was Italian, my father wasn't, but we were always Italian.
Yeah.
Always the mother's side.
Yes,
mostly. It's
right.
The mother who takes the...
Plus, it was a neighborhood in Brooklyn, Bensonhurst, that was half Jewish and half Italian, and most of the people worked in the garment industry. So we shared a lot, and our parish church was almost directly across the street. And the few relatives that we had also lived within walking distance in that neighborhood. My aunt specifically, who I will probably mention later. So yes, it was very culturally an Italian Sicilian household. And I heard Sicilian spoken. We were not encouraged to speak it. It was spoken mostly when they didn't want us to understand. But I do understand a lot.
How different is Sicilian than Italian?
Very.
I didn't realize that.
Linguistically, technically, it's a separate language. It is so different than standard Italian. But then there are dialects, as there are dialects within standard Italian, there are dialects within Sicilian. So a Sicilian from Palermo will have a distinctly different dialect than someone from Catania or Agrigento.
So if you grew up in, say, Venice, and you're speaking to someone from Sicily, you probably wouldn't understand them?
It might be a little difficult. I mean, standard example I give to people in the dialect that my family spoke. Bella, beautiful in Italian, standard Italian. In Sicilian dialect that we speak, it's bedru, B-E-D-R-U, bedru. So it's bedru madre, when you're upset, dear mother, that kind of thing. So it is very different. And there's an influence of other languages there because southern Italy was repeatedly occupied by other cultures and societies, particularly the Arab one.
Do you speak Sicilian fluently?
No.
Do you understand?
I can make myself understood. When I was 16 and my family went to Sicily, they laughed at me because when I tried to speak and communicate. I had a vocabulary, but it was all in dialect. So here was this modern American 16-year-old speaking this ancient tongue. They thought that was funny.
Hildegard, tell us a little bit more about the German side of the family. Was it a big family, or was it more the Italian that was the larger part of the family?
Well, we didn't live as close to each other. By the time things I can remember about the German side of the family, my father's own mother died when he was a teenager. So by the time I came along, his father had remarried to a German woman of a family that the two families had known each other, and they lived in Queens, in Elmhurst, Queens. And we saw them less frequently. After World War II, they brought my great-grandfather here from Germany because he was in East Germany and things were very bad there in the 50s, and they brought him. But he didn't speak any English, so he was just Gross Opa, who was sitting in the corner. We spent Christmas Eve. We had a German Christmas Eve.
With the cold cuts and the whole routine?
And Santa Claus who came. And presents from the whole family and all of that. And we visited, I mentioned this trip when I was 16 to Europe with my family. We spent 3 months in Europe, and we met all of our German relatives. So we went to Berlin, we went to Mainz, where we had relatives, my grandfather's siblings. We were in Berlin 2 weeks before the wall went up. In 1961.
So you were able to leave before the wall went
Yeah,
up.
we had trouble getting across East Germany to get into Berlin at the time. Berlin was surrounded by East Germany and it was partitioned. But, and it was difficult to get there. The Russians made it difficult to pass through the border. But then we went to Berlin and there was no problem. It was unpleasant to be looking over a barbed wire fence everywhere and soldiers with guns. We were totally inexperienced in that kind of thing. And then after we left Berlin, we traveled back down the Rhine across the Alps, and we were in Lake Como, and woke up one morning to the news that the wall had gone up, and we said, oh, that's why we had so many problems.
You didn't know?
No.
Yeah.
They were probably limiting how many non-citizens they were going to have in the city when they planning that action.
Of course, in the Italian tradition, food is very big, but in Germany it is too. So did you have favorite foods from the German side and the Italian side growing up? Do you remember?
Well, my mother learned to make some things, or sometimes she would be making a very Italian dish, and she would placate my father by having pig's feet and sauerkraut, or and all the fish on Christmas Eve. Well, there was always smoked whitefish, smoked eel for my father, from the northern Germany near the North Sea. That salted fish, very much like the Ashkenazi Jewish diet, whitefish and that kind of thing. Eel would be non-kosher to them, but we enjoyed having the Jewish food around too. My grandmother, the only grandmother I knew who was my father's stepmother, was a wonderful baker, which Germans are very famous for. And stolen, just wonderful cakes, wonderful torts with fruit and a jelly, clear jelly above. They were like works of art, sliced peaches and blueberries, and just delicious. I remember loving sauerbraten, but I don't recall that my mother ever made it, and wursts and things like that.
Schnitzels.
And a really good potato salad. That kind of thing.
Yeah.
But it was, much greater was the influence of the Italian cuisine.
So, how about you yourself? A good cook?
Yes.
What do you like to dabble in?
Well, I don't do it as much anymore. I should tell you that my mother was famous for her manigotti, which she made from scratch. And when he was 16, my youngest son said to me, "Mom, do we know how to make those?" And I said, Andrew, I never make them because Noni always brings them to our holiday dinners. He said, well, I think we need to learn. So I made an appointment with my mother, and my son and I went, and we learned every step of the way. And now all of my sons make managotti, and I've never have.
Ah, okay.
But,
That's better. Have
yeah.
your sons do it.
Italian rum cake,
Mhm.
that was one of my specialties. Going to a party, Hilda, bring your stuffed mushrooms. I love stuffed artichokes. People seem to like my sauce. I make a lot of a marinara sauce.
Not gravy sauce, right?
Sauce.
Okay.
Sauce.
I always have that discussion with Italian people.
Sauce.
Some say gravy, some say sauce.
Well, I think that just comes because it was a convenient English word to use. And my mother was an excellent cook.
Tell us more about your mother, Sicily, and in the background where everyone came from.
Castellammare del Golfo is about an hour's drive west of Palermo toward Trapani, where at the point, the furthest northwestern point of Sicily, is a town called Erici, which is very famous. It is beautiful. Sicily is very beautiful. It was primarily a fishing village, although there are farms. My Italian grandfather's name was Francesco Milazzo, and he was a farming background. My maternal grandmother's name was Rosalia Galanti, and her father was more well-to-do, had a ship. It sounds more like he was what we would call a long-haul trucker, but on the sea, bringing merchandise from place to place. But it's an unfortunate story there. He and his first wife, that's my great-grandfather and great-grandmother, had 4 children. At the birth of the 4th child, who's my aunt that I referred to before, within a month of that birth, she died, leaving almost grown sons and a 10 or 11-year-old daughter and a newborn baby. And things did not go well. That happened in 1910. By then came along World War I, which made for financial difficulties. My great-grandfather decided to remarry, and the woman he remarried managed to convince him to sell his boat or whatever because she didn't like his being away from her for so much. If you're a ship captain, you're not home. They had a little boy. So in the second marriage, he produced this little boy. But then my great-grandfather changed his mind and wanted very much to get another boat and be able to work with his 2 sons, who by now were looking for making a livelihood and lives of their own and marrying. And his wife would not cooperate. And I learned on my trip there 4 years ago that she had deliberately hidden money from him. Mm-hmm. And in 1916, he committed suicide. Mm-hmm. He took poison. Mm-hmm. Of course, I didn't learn all these details until much later. So that left 2 young men, his sons, contemplating marriage and how they're going to make their way in the world. A daughter who's 16, 17 years old, and her little sister. So my grandfather, that farmer's son, Francesco Galanti, in the meantime, Francesco Milazzo, he had already come to the United States before World War I, served in the American Army in World War I, served in France, and after he came home in 1920, he went back to Sicily expecting, I think, that he was going to do something with money he had been sending back there. Maybe they were supposed to buy land for him or hold on to the money, whatever. When he got there, he found out that had not been done. And the legend was that he had to be held back from throwing his brother down a well. And he was, very upset, distraught, disappointed, and said, I'm getting out of here. I'm going back to America. There's nothing here for me. And his mother prevailed upon him. She said, look, you're in your late 30s already. You don't even have a family. Marry somebody here and go back with a decent wife and make a family. Somehow or another, I don't know how the connection was made, but he came to meet my grandmother, Rosalia, who was now motherless, fatherless, with the care of a younger sister in her charge. And my grandfather agreed that if she married him, they would come to the United States and bring the little girl with them. So in 1921, that's what they did, probably leaving in like September or late October. And they arrived in the United States in November. But immigration would not allow my aunt in.
Why is that?
Not allow what?
My aunt, the little girl, they would not allow her.
Did they go through Ellis Island?
Yes. This is speculation, but it's the only story that makes sense. My grandfather had been out of the country for over a year. Therefore, he did not have a pay stub or a bank book to present to the authorities and prove that he could support this minor child who was not his own. And he could bring in his wife on his passport, but not this child. So at 11 years of age, she was detained alone.
They left her?
They had to. I mean, he had to come into the country to make arrangements to prove to them that he could support her.
So where was she detained?
In Ellis Island for 2 weeks. And there's some of her poems in the book about her are about that experience. But we heard the story every Thanksgiving because while she was there, it was Thanksgiving time. And they had a big celebratory meal, and she remembered the food and so on. And she was sick during this period of time. And she said there was a woman there with a large number of children who kind of took her under her wing and would be sure to make it seem that my aunt was just fine so they wouldn't remove her to the infirmary. She didn't want to be separate, this child to be separated again from anybody who had any concern for her.
Well, thank goodness for her, I guess.
Yes.
There are always good people who do step up.
Yeah. Are there facilities at Ellis Island to take care of
Oh,
people?
yes, there were dormitories, yes.
Just in case of a situation like
Well,
this?
many were detained for various reasons.
Were they treated well?
She never outright said that anyone was mean or hurtful, but she said they were uncomfortable, these iron beds, and it was cold, and she was lonely, and the sounds were different, and you know, you're right in the middle of New York Harbor there, so you're hearing horns and whistles and things like that.
To Ellis Island?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, it's an experience.
Yeah.
So then her father eventually came back and could
Her,
prove that he
her
could...
brother-in-law.
Her brother-in-law came back and eventually...
Yes, and
everything
they lived
worked
in the
out.
Lower East Side, where my mother was born in 1924. So they came here in 21. In 24, my mother was born, their first child. And then the Depression came. My grandfather lost everything except the house that they were living in. And my grandmother gave birth in December of 1930 to a second child, a boy. And within 3 months, she was dead. They'd say she had a very bad cold, and I think, and complained of headaches. I think she got a sinus infection that went to her brain and then just created sepsis, and she was gone.
Yeah.
She died in a hospital.
Was it a big family as far as your mother? Did your mother have a lot of siblings?
No, just this brother, this younger brother, who was an infant when his mother died, and he never married. So my grandfather had a sister in this country, but we only occasionally saw them. We didn't have a close relationship with them. They lived in Canarsie.
So the brother had not married, had no children.
No,
Okay.
no. In Sicily, however, on the Galanti side, that's my grandmother's side, there were lots because her father was one of 12 children.
And what about your father's side of the family? Siblings?
He had one older sister, but not many relatives here. But we know my maiden name was Nimke, Nimke. It might have been changed from an earlier spelling,
That doesn't sound
like
Italian either.
Nimcke. You know,
Is that
German.
German?
German. And my father, whenever he traveled, he would look for Nimke's in the phone book. And we found some, but we've never successfully been able to figure out where the ultimate, generations back, the connection was. In Germany, my grandfather had 2 brothers and 3 sisters. So there's cousins and so on.
And what about yourself? With siblings?
I have 1 sister.
Is she still alive?
Yes.
Oh, nice. And is she nearby?
Rosalinda, because she's named after Rosalia, my grandmother. See, my mother...
She's the patron saint of Sicily,
right.
Rosalia.
The cultural thing. My father's overseas. My mother gives birth to me and names me after, in the Italian custom, the father's mother.
Right.
So his mother's name was Hildegard.
Hildegard.
And my sister's named after my mother's mother, whose name was Rosalia. So she named her Rosalinda.
So other than your sister, your children, and your grandchildren, are there any relatives still in your life?
Yes. My grandmother, one of my grandmother's 2 brothers, one came to the United States also. One remained in Castellammare del Golfo, and one came here. And he had 3 children, and one of those children, he himself had 5 children, and that family cluster is down in the Newburgh area.
Do you see them?
Yes.
Nice.
Not all that frequently, but we keep in touch.
Yeah.
I am now the oldest living descendant of those original immigrants that I described to you.
So you're very active and very busy too. You're part of a lot of organizations. You're an author too. Tell us about your book.
Well, when my aunt, who's the little girl who was held at Ellis Island, her name was Carmelina, often called Carmela, but to me, Aunt Millie. She married, but she did not have children, and that's a very sad story. Remained married and went to work at a very young age. They never let her go to school. So the only real schooling she had was a few years in Italy. They would leave her in their tenement apartment in the Lower East Side all day and go to work.
How did she learn what she needed to learn?
Until she was old enough to work on her own. Well, these people were obviously very smart, because my aunt did learn to speak English. She could write English. It was very, kind of stilted, but I found in my parents' letters that she wrote to my father in the service during the war, and they're absolutely dear. And I marvel at her not being embarrassed to write in her limited fashion. It's like, I don't care.
Give her books.
She became a citizen, so she took the test, she
Good
studied what she has to do, but she ended up, because her skills became so good over time, she ended up working in what's called the sample room of a couturier designer in the garment industry. And that designer, for example, did one of Mamie Eisenhower's inaugural ball gowns. And the sample room is where they make the first model of a dress. And so you really have to know your stuff. You have a person who can make the pattern and cut and
That's really
beading
something.
and fitting and all of this. So my aunt could make anything. She did wedding dresses. She could make a dress for me as a child just on a Saturday afternoon without a pattern. She knit, she crocheted, all kinds of things, and was an excellent, excellent cook. But by the time she was 40, she had begun to battle breast cancer. And by her 50s, she had had double radical mastectomy, radiation. I mean, this is in the 1960s, early 60s, late 50s, early 60s.
Yeah.
And at the age of 54 or so in 1964, right after Kennedy's assassination, she had decided that she would move with her husband and mother-in-law to Arizona. And we think now that she wanted the move because she knew her cancer had metastasized, and she didn't want to be close to my mother, where my mother would be left to have to take care of her. Because my mother had looked after her at my house after the radical mastectomies, and it was not a picnic, it's hard. But my mother was also caring for her family and children and all of this. So, in late 63, President Kennedy is assassinated on November 22nd, and right after the turn of the new year, my grandfather, who was vacationing in Sicily, died in Sicily. And my mother and her brother went to Sicily and were there when he died. He was in the hospital. They got him out of the hospital, but he died at home. And my aunt is contemplating her own demise. We've lived through that huge mourning experience of Kennedy, and then my grandfather died. And all of a sudden, my aunt comes over and says, "Look what I'm doing. I'm writing." And she's writing poetry in Sicilian, like 2 a day. It's like spewing out of her. And there ended up to be a body of about 50 of these poems.
And this is the woman that never went to school.
Right.
Wow.
So, within a year of writing these things, they moved to Arizona. In 1967, so that was like in 1964, 65. In 67, I get married. My aunt came to the wedding, but she came off the plane in a wheelchair. In the next summer of 1968, I said, I'm going to go visit her because she's ill. We knew that the cancer had metastasized. I said, and I don't want to spend my money to go to a funeral. I want to go and be with her. So I went and spent 2 weeks with her. 5 days after I left, she died. It's like she was waiting for me to come because she had given a lot of things away. So she's 57, 58 years old. But she had some other things, and she entrusted them to me and said, give this to so-and-so, give this to so-and-so, this is for you. And then she handed me the poems. And all handwritten on loose leaf paper. So I treasured them and held them for all of these years. Then, in the 1990s, I had become a school librarian. I had been a teacher, then I became a school librarian, and I got a job at Red Hook Middle School, where I met a parent of one of the students who was born in Palermo, had a master's degree from Columbia University, so she was very skilled in Italian and English and could read the dialect, and she spent every summer in Sicily. And I shared the poems with her, and she said, these have to see the light of day. And she helped me to understand. She said, your aunt was writing her autobiography in these poems. She was telling her life story in the only storytelling form that was part of her cultural DNA and in her knowledge. That kind of sing-songy storytelling with rhyme that is common in the Sicilian culture and in many other cultures, but it's what was really already part of her. So when, after my parents died and, all kinds of things and years passed, I, with the help and encouragement of this woman that I'd met in Red Hook, a society in Italy that was a society of the families of the emigrated, a society of families whose relatives had come to the United States, had left the country. They published the poems first and a biographical piece that I wrote, but it was a very limited edition. It was a small edition and it wasn't bilingual. And I felt eventually, after my parents died and I had a little money, I said, my parents would be delighted if I took some of this money and created this book. So with my friend's help, because she had lots of connections, literary and scholarly connections in Palermo, that helped a lot.
Is the book available still?
No.
No.
Eventually, I took it off Amazon, and because you pay a fee to have your book there. So I have, I don't know, maybe 30, 40 copies.
Yeah.
So this book is bilingual. There's a biography that I wrote. There's an essay from a psychological point of view about my aunt that my friend wrote, because that was her field of study here. Then there's all the poems. There's not an exact English translation of the poems because it was impossible to imitate the rhyme and all of that. So I had them translated, but then I took them and wrote as graceful a narrative as I could produce that communicated the meanings and the feeling of her original poems. That's there. Then there's an essay by a Sicilian poet who talks about this tradition of storytelling in this particular form. And they all appear in both languages. And the title is in Sicilian. It means, with you I could have had fortress and castle, because what comes through in the poems is her lifelong longing for place, her home, land, and her mother. And somehow the place and the mother are conflated, but she was always longing for that. And she began going back and visiting Sicily regularly as early as the 1930s. She went a lot.
So the poems, the biography here dates back to when she was a little girl. Is that when this started?
She starts with a poem about
Ellis Island?
No, there is a poem about Ellis Island, but she just talks about living alone in Sicily in a careless kind of carefree kind of childhood, although there were hard times. I mean, I remember her telling me we didn't have milk. There were different things that she felt deprived of. But she talks about alla marina io fu nata, dunni me soro fu guidata, where I lived near the sea, where my sister guided me. Menzo pene e menzo dolura, li passaiamo senza premura. We passed without too much anxiety, and that's how that poem begins. But then she wrote about Ellis Island. She wrote about her marriage. She wrote about her total inability as a youngster to understand her sister deserting her by getting married. What she went through with her husband here, her loss of faith, and then her rediscovering her faith. She talks about a dream, a very significant spiritual dream that she had that made all the difference. So when I knew her in my childhood, she was a very devout Catholic, and the church was right across the street from us. So whenever she went to church, we saw her. She would visit us. And that was a big influence on me, because in our household, 3 generations, 4 adults, 2 children, none of the adults went to church.
Wow.
But we were sent, my sister and I were dressed up in our little pinafores and sent right off to 9 o'clock children's mass on Sunday. We received all the sacraments, and my parents supported that, and they would help us memorize the catechism the way we used to have to do, but they were not churchy people.
Do you look back and miss those days, or is it more like reminiscing and thinking it was nice, but we have to move on with today's world?
Oh, I reminisce a lot.
Yeah.
I reminisce a lot. And she, somehow or another, I sensed her longing, and I could visualize the village, and she was really the only one who talked about that. And of course, it was unknown to my mother. She was born here. And my grandfather was a very down-to-earth, practical guy. He was a wonderful grandfather. I just wrote a memoir piece about him. He was a very gentle, loving, patient man. And my mother, who was burdened by a household with a number of adult working men and hot meal on the table every night, she would say, "Papa, take them out," and he'd take us to the library or the park or even to the museum in New York. I remember going to the Museum of the City of New York. I guess we were studying New Amsterdam or whatever, so he took us to the museum. And he's reading us the labels in his broken you know.
Yeah.
He didn't exactly speak a broken English. It was a good English. He was a union organizer for the ILGW, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, and you know, a floor, you know, guy. He got into trouble with the union because he was a whistleblower about corrupt union practices. So he became persona non grata to them. But he worked in the factory all his life. But he was periodically at home because there were slow seasons in the garment industry.
Yeah.
Like usually between Thanksgiving and Christmas was slow because they'd gotten out the Palm Beach line, and it didn't really start on the next fashion line until after Christmas.
So growing up, I had a favorite relative. Was this aunt your favorite relative?
Probably, yeah. She was not tall. She was. You would never call her statuesque. A little overweight, but very elegant, with extremely good taste, and never overdressed. Simple elegance was always the thing, but the little jewelry she had was always just elegant and perfect for what she had on. A nice perfume, and she was a hard-working woman, much more intelligent and highly motivated than her husband. I learned through my parents' letters that she bought a house in Brooklyn during the war. I didn't even know that. The house that I remembered her living in was really her second bought home. So she was very capable, a native smartness. And as I said, she saw to it that she became a citizen and did what she had to do. Now, she had lots of friends, and it's not surprising that given her history of desertions, loss of mother, loss of sister, you know, loss of the faithfulness of a husband, and so on, that she wanted friends desperately, and she needed the love of friends. So she was a very good friend and had a lot of friends. But if you didn't quite return that to her, she would be easily hurt.
Sensitive?
Yes.
You know, you mentioned the word elegant. Do you think that word is missing from today's society?
Right. I mean, yeah. I recently had a friend of mine who's a professional photographer developed for me black and white film that my father took on our 1961 trip to Europe and never had prints made. And if you look at those pictures, my mother's wearing a corsage to fly to Europe. And my aunt and my mother spent all spring of 1961 making clothing for my sister and I to wear in Europe, because we went to Catholic high school and wore uniforms. And most of our other clothes were kind of play and informal clothes, not many dress things. And we couldn't wear pants on that trip. We were dressed like ladies. not overdressed, but properly dressed for the time. My mother, too, was trained in fashion design. My mother did some of the paintings here, and my son is an artist, so it goes through the family. But my mother also, very petite and a hardworking woman. She never went to the beauty parlor, and she never had a manicure. She did all her house cleaning. But when she went out, she looked like she stepped out of a bandbox. Perfectly coiffed, elegant simplicity, once again. And my father loved to buy her beautiful jewelry because he liked beautiful things. He was very simple in himself, didn't even wear a tie tack, but he loved getting her beautiful things.
Most people today don't even know what a tie tack is. But I remember that, sure.
Yeah, he just wore a plain gold wedding band.
Yeah.
And a watch, and that was it. He was an engineer. Another cultural thing that's amazing, because you asked, how did this couple come together? There was a wonderful, mutual respect between my grandfather and my father. I never heard them argue. He didn't call him, sometimes he'd call him Pop, but most of the time it was Frank. And I have a letter in this collection from my parents in which my grandfather addressed my father as son. I don't know where that came. You know, some Italians reject anybody who's outside, if they're not Italian. And yet, when this young man came into the picture, he was very readily welcomed. Now, that may have been assisted by the war and young men going off to war and a respect for them. My father had a year and a half of college. He was a very brilliant man. Well-read, loved classical music, but he could also build anything, make anything, and he did a lot of projects around the house. But it was beautiful to see that mutual respect between them. That's quite a model for someone to carry through their lives, seeing that so intimately.
Yeah. So before we wrap up this wonderful conversation, tell us a little bit more about what you're involved with today. You have a lot of organizations that you spend your time with.
Right. Well, I became a teacher, and then I had children. And when my sons were 5, 8, and 11, my husband and I separated. In 1974, we had moved to Kingston from Connecticut. So I went back to teaching at that time and was looking for a job in the public school system, which was eluding me every year. So I went back to college and got a second master's degree in library science and became a school librarian. But all along, I was very active in organizations here because I didn't know a soul when we moved here. So by joining things, you meet people, right? And I was active in St. Joseph's Parish and the Quilters Guild and a few other things. Then I am fond of saying, the kids came back from college and I left. We had a house on Main Street, which my son still lives in. And I, at that time, made the decision to enter a contemplative religious community that had a monastery on the grounds of Mount St. Alphonsus. And for 15 and a half years, I was a member of that community. In 2000, due to a lot of different factors, the greatest complication of which was that the mount was sold and we lost our monastery and we were unsuccessful in finding a new home, and that's a whole other romance. I decided that there was no longer the place for me to be and left the community and came back here to live, and was fortunate enough to get this apartment at the Birches. So what am I involved here? I got back involved in the Quilters Guild, of which I was a charter member, and I joined St. Joseph's Parish in New Paltz, where I am a lector. I've been a member of the Italian American group, and then I wanted to be just like a docent at Friends of a Star at Kingston, but the director remembered my professional background, so now I'm their archivist, volunteer archivist, which I love. I was a history major in college, and sometimes something really interests me, and I do a lot of research, and I've written some papers for them. And then there is a lifelong learning institute out of Saugerties called LifeSpring. And colleges frequently have these, they're called LLIs, Lifelong Learning Institutes. And now I'm active on their curriculum committee. So I feel like I'm a booking agent because like we're in our fall semester right now, and I'm participating in that, but simultaneously I'm on the curriculum committee preparing the courses for the spring semester. So I have to divide my mind. This is this schedule, this is this schedule. So I'm meeting a lot of interesting people, and my connections and little things here and there help me to find people who are generous enough to want to offer presentations for our group.
And being involved in all that helps you feel young, right? Keeps you young.
Well, yeah, as I said before, rather than concentrating on what you can no longer do, which at my age, those things are coming along, to try to do as much as you can with what you've got and what you can still use. And evidently, I can still be very helpful in certain areas.
Terrific.
And it proves to you that your brain's still working.
Exactly. So we've been chatting with Hildegard Pleva about her life, her Italian background, her German background. Been a delightful conversation. Thank you so much for allowing us to come over and do this.
You're welcome. Thank you. I hope this is useful in the future for others.